Good morning. Good morning to the Caron YouTube audience. Today is the 7th of August, 2022, if you're watching at some future date. And good morning again to those of you who are with me and those watching around campus on the live stream. Kind of taken aback by the music, which the YouTube community will not have had the benefit of experiencing, but also a little nervous, and have wrestled myself with the message for today most of the week. And it occurred to me that I would like to start with a personal piece of the puzzle. Although the topic of today is suffering, and yay! So August 6th, yesterday, is a day of meaning in my life for two conflicting reasons. August 6th happens to be the birth date of my younger of two stepsons, and we got to celebrate in a very nice way this past couple of days with him. I've talked about Jared a number of times for those of you who are regular attendees or listeners, and so that's a bright moment. But also 5 years ago, on the 6th of August, when I was outside tending to the grill for his birthday bash, my wife came out from the house and asked me to take the phone, and I received a piece of news, which was that my next older brother, Steve, at that time my oldest brother, a further aged brother, had already passed away. So I learned on August 6th of 2017 that Steve had been in a tragic motorcycle accident. Steve and I had had a long journey in life. He was just barely 2 years older than me, more than 1 year, but not quite fully 2 years older than me. And we had our ups and downs, but for the preceding 12 or 14 years, we had become quite close because we shared this peculiar thing, which is sobriety. So we'd become close in recovery, and Steve had been out riding a motorcycle with two of his AA buddies. In fact, he was on his way to a motorcycle AA gathering. Who knew there were such things, but there are such things. And on his way, with two gentlemen behind him and him leading the pack, he was coming down a hill on a remote highway at a high rate of speed, and a deer jumped in front of him. And it was a disastrous event in our family life and in Steve's life, and I was trying to do the math. 18 days later, he would pass away. So I think it's interesting for me, not only am I speaking about suffering, the day after I remember that event and celebrate Jared's birthday, but I was thinking about how often this has happened to me. I was an atheist to become preacher. So I was reminded of a day a number of years ago. Those of you who are old enough will know this date probably. On you won't know by date, but on December 26th of 2004, I had a weird such day. It was a Sunday, and I was coming in to preach. And 2 nights before, which was Christmas Eve, I was in a Christian Protestant congregation at the time as the senior pastor of a good-sized church. And so 2 nights before, I preached Christmas Eve, which the essential message of Christmas Eve is a God is with us message. It's a message of accompaniment and of miracles and of new birth and of really, I think, a kind of quiet exuberance. Interestingly, it's one of my favorite elements of the Christian narrative to speak into and about. And then in this particular community, I didn't have church on the 25th, but I had church on the 26th. So the 26th, I'm coming in for Sunday church, and the Sunday after Christmas is normally a little bit of like a denouement, not necessarily a big whoop kind of a day anyway, in that tradition. And I learned that in 2004, that like 10 hours before, the tsunami that had devastated Southeast Asia had just occurred. So the news in the morning as I was getting ready to go in for church was of this earthquake in the Indian Ocean and this devastation of the Southeast Asian coast. And some presumed ghastly number of lives taken in this bizarrely apocalyptic sort of scenes. There were just beginning to be images of, and of a very few people who seemed to hold onto trees and survive. And so, why I bring these two elements up is they have made concrete for me the challenge that I and many of our patients feel, which is that they read these things called the 12 steps, or they come into addiction recovery and are encouraged to develop a spiritual life in which they're supposed to relate to a power greater than themselves and develop trust in this power greater than themselves and feel even a sense of being loved in this, hold by this power greater than oneself. And the question becomes, how? How do I believe in a power greater than myself that has that kind of capacity to be safe and trustable and reliable and a kind of a nest in which I can lay when a sober brother loses his functioning and 18 days later his life taken out of play in the ball field of life, just like that, or when millions of people are devastated, and it's hard to ascribe blame in either of those instances. I think I have less trouble with the problem of evil, because when there are wicked people out there doing things, I'm like, well, that's just wicked people doing things, and it doesn't throw me off as badly. I mean, I can understand that's a theological issue, because people are like, well, why would God allow jerks? But my big problem is feeling safe and trusting in God when I really don't know if I'm going to get hit by a bus in the next 30 seconds, right? So I wanted to talk. I just was thinking about suffering and if we are in the context of suffering and what to do about it. Those are the kinds of things that will come up as I walk through the next few minutes. And one of the first places that I needed to go in my own journey of wrestling with these things prior to 2004 and 2017 was in my own awakenings to sobriety and dealing with adverse events in my life. I went to seminary, not yet fully clarified in what I would express as my own faith and belief, but really kind of seeking. I went to seminary, in a Protestant seminary, as a seeker of faith, which is kind of a funny thing. I was in a minority there. But, and I learned so much about myself and about that tradition, and it helped me sort of move forward in my life. And one of the great people at that seminary I went to was a guy named Kendall Solon. I've spoken about him before. And he's one of the people I kind of revisited this week because he's accessible in writing and in podcasts. And so it's listening to Kendall talk about evil, and it just took me back to 1996, sitting in his classroom. And Kendall was a loving, gentle, brilliant, is a loving, gentle, and brilliant theologian. And one of the things he taught me about this, Kendall would say the same thing in a class on theodicy, which is the problem of justifying God in the face of evil and suffering. But I'm going to say it here. A disclaimer. If you're going to be disappointed, I apologize, but I am not going to resolve the problem of evil in the next 8 minutes. It's a big, long challenge in the project of seeking to explain or understand faith in Buddhism and Hinduism, Christianity, and Islam and Judaism. All the major wisdom traditions engage the topic. And there are interesting things in common with the way wisdom traditions access human struggle and life, and climatic events and all that sort of stuff. But here I was in this journey of my own search for faith, and Kendall exposed me to the work of an early 20th century theologian named Karl Barth. And one of the things that Barth says on this subject, which I think is tremendously helpful, is that he sort of discourages people who suggest that Christianity explains suffering. And what he says is that instead of understanding the problem of suffering, that Barth proposes that this faith and this tradition helps withstand suffering. That's an interesting distinction, right? And it's kind of I'll take that as an offer, right? Because there's a little part of me that would like to understand, but if you can help me withstand it, and that was the problem I had when Stephen was in ICU and non-responsive, and we were all trying to figure out like where we go with his medical condition. It was a terrible struggle. It was bad enough for me. It was horrible for his wife of 30 years. It was miserable for his kids. It was awful. And how do you endure these cataclysmic and life events is really hard. And so if there is a way to withstand that with not only dignity but kind of hope and optimism, I want it. And in the midst of seeking to know how to withstand it, one of the pieces, one of the gems, I think, of understanding is humility. The limits of our capacity to really fully know or explain. Because of our tininess. I'm remembered of a little comic I used to keep on my little bulletin board when I was in seminary, which was Ziggy, you know the Ziggy figure, and Ziggy on the planet looking up at the stars and wondering, like about his own finitude and the massive sort of scope of the universe and of time. And it's just, to me, arrogance if I think that I can figure almost any of it out against the grand scale of both universe and history. But what Bart said, I'll return to, which is what that tradition offers in terms of help for those of us who are withstanding suffering. But a quick next step, detour, is to talk about the reality of suffering here, for you and for us and for this audience and for the here and now. And I'm not gonna, if I had more time, I would talk about the deaths in Philadelphia or the socio-political sort of mess that I fear that we are in. But also, I am privileged to stand here at Magic Mountain, which is a point of intersection, which patients and families come together with the problem of addiction. And that is suffering enough. It is miserable. Withdrawal sucks, excuse me for my vernacular. Watching a loved one get taken into this spiral is horrible and horrifying. Even if you don't experience the suicide or overdose, that is the frequent terminus of the miserable eventuality that addiction has become in our day-to-day lives. And I would venture to guess that everybody in the listening sphere here could figure out someone that you know that has ended up either dead by overdose or dead by suicide in relation to the problem of addiction, or is incarcerated. This is I know I use big words, this is a ubiquitous phenomenon. It's present in all of our lives, it's everywhere. You don't need 6 degrees of separation to get to where this is a real and present issue of suffering. And those of you who have a wristband have a personal ticket to the horror ride of addiction. You have not only experienced the threat of imprisonment and potential medical complication, all that stuff, but you are probably in a situation where relationships are fraying. You probably are in a situation where your sense of vocation or employment or purpose or school or whatever it was that you had been wishing for and other people were cheering you on about is like now in question. And you may have the law after you. It's been helpful for me as I work as a clinician here to remember that it sucks to be here because of these facts. It's an unpleasant circumstance that brings people to Caron. And I'm like Mr. Cheerleader here. I want people to be like, oh, I'm in rehab and I'm going to get well. And people are like, that's a stretch, dude. So there are real and present flesh and blood sufferings that bring people to this audience. Either you're watching on the YouTube channel because you have a connection to addiction, or you're sitting here in front of me, or you're in a patient community on this campus today and watching on the camera like that. And what help is there to withstand this? Well, another detour I'm going to make quickly on my way back and then out of this message today is, interestingly, not into my sort of core own wisdom traditions, but to the traditions of the East, especially Buddhism. I'm just going to notice something about Buddhism and Hinduism, because I've taken a tremendous interest in these things as a whole, in wisdom traditions, indigenous and Eastern and Western, which is already like an interesting categorization of these things, but there's a bunch of these wisdom traditions, and I think as much as each one merits some attention as its own thing, it's also fair to notice comparisons and parallels, and meaningful to do so. So what I find in looking at Buddhism and Hinduism and Sikhism, the traditions that come from East Asia are, first of all, a deep acknowledgement of the problem of suffering, and a very central address to the problem of suffering. And I really misunderstood those traditions when I was a young man for a variety of reasons. I was mistaught in Sunday school about them, and I was naive and ignorant about them. But now that I've worked at Caron these years, and then I'm part of the recovery community, I've had a ton of people who've brought me better information about these traditions. And one of the things that has really made me have a great deal of respect and admiration and a deeper interest in them is the emphasis within them on compassion, love, and loving kindness and forgiveness. Like those are all top notes, if it was a perfume, in the practice of Buddhism and in the Hindu sort of gist of it, of the spiritual, like the flavor of Hinduism, when richly practiced, these are wisdom traditions where compassion and forgiveness are in the foreground. And the word compassion in English comes from Latin and is meaning suffer with. I don't know if probably many of us who are not Latin students would know that. But so we're translating some Pali word as compassion. But this is a what to do piece of the puzzle. What to do in the face of suffering is to bring compassion and forgiveness. Because where there is evil or whatever, another thing I learned from Kendall is that yes, there can be evil that comes from non-human spiritual forces, but the biggest problems that we have with evil in our world are our own. Things that human beings do with, towards, and in impact on one another. So, a beautiful thing that I like to think of and say every day is the Lord's Prayer, and it's like, deliver us from evil, and that means us, not them, because we perpetrate suffering on one another. And if I were to adopt this Eastern intentionality, it would be to seek to move out of inflicting suffering and to be a person of compassion towards people who have suffering. And if I were to stop there, I feel like that would make us, we would live in a much better world. I feel like if we were to set our agenda on loving and being loving towards one another and seeing those who have harmed us in a loving light and moving in that direction, I think that's a notch up from the day-to-day tenor of the world in which we live. But I wanted to go back to Kendall Solon and what happened to him and what happened to me and my presence in the audience of his teachings about the faith of my tradition growing up, which is one of the Christian expressions of faith. And what he offered me was the idea that I could see myself as a child of a power greater than myself that helped me to withstand suffering through accompaniment, through presence, more so than through intervention. So I want God to reach down and take Steve or take the deer and separate them. That's what I want. But the God that I have come to believe in accompanies Stephen, his now widow, his children, his loved ones, all through this journey of life. And so, where the Buddhist teaching calls me to love and be loved horizontally, I also have been, I'm going to say, blessed to allow myself to think of myself as living in a world in which I am loving and being loved vertically. That there's some transcendent reality that holds me, and that I would love to say I can fully explain it. I would love to say I can understand where this divine being is at present in the work of today's politics over the weekend, or where divine presence is at work in the conflict between the West and the East nationally over issues of terrorism and Taiwan and all that sort of stuff. But I'm left with the humility touch point that is this seeking of understanding may be arrogant on my part and beyond my scope. And what I am invited to do is to allow myself to mysteriously believe that ultimately that love wins in the end. That there will be an outcome ultimately for me and for us and for humanity and for creation that is one in which this transcendent presence that expressed itself in the faith of my tradition, but also is expressed in your day-to-day lives, gets us through. And that the wisest thing we can do in the face of the immediate sufferings that we have is mirror what I'm talking about and practice love to one another in inspiration from this idea that we are fundamentally loved. And you may not like that message or want to run towards it because of my association of it with a particular tradition. I had terrible trouble with the tradition I grew up with. But I also think it's a beautiful word. This is an invitation that has been picked up by the 12 steps and is present in its own way in the Eastern traditions, and I would argue is findable in Judaism and Islam and out there, that we see ourselves in a world that is not pernicious and not evil and not deplorable and not something we should give up on, but instead that we, in the context of our suffering moments, allow ourselves to believe we are fundamentally not alone. Also, we're not alone. And so to be companions to one another in the journey of suffering that we are, and to practice compassion and love and mercy and forgiveness as our very best alternative and as the inspiration we take from the faith that we hold if we have such faith. And last word. That's what I think chapel incarnates. I think that's what we find here. What we find here and in the 12-step movements and in Recovery Dharma and in Smart Recovery, in these constituted communities of recovery from addiction, we find loving mutuality, care, compassion, and support. We find people using this very notion that the suffering cannot be fully avoided, but that our way through the suffering and towards flourishing and fulfillment and better life is to practice communities of compassion with one another. So that's where you are. And you may not have thought you were coming here just to become a constituent of a community of compassion. But I think there is immense power in that. I'm not averse to medication-assisted treatment. I'm not averse to good therapy. I think both of those things help tremendous numbers of people, and the therapy piece was absolutely essential in getting me out of my quagmire. But I also believe the single most important thing that gets me sober in front of you today is love. And that love is the proper response to suffering. So let us seek to be loving in response to the love we find. And that's my call. Thanks.